Hello, everybody. Today we're going to look at the quick history of Asia, starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, from this lovely accommodated room in the library. So a little different than normal. So there's a few notes to go with this as well. This section is already filled in until the end of the note sheet. You'll see a few spots on the slides here to fill those in. So here we go. To begin, Asia faced a lot of problems in the late 1800s, early 1900s with colonialism and imperialism. You see that nearly every Asian country spent some years as a colony of Europe, basically being forced to do what Europe would want them to do. And the reason for that is that Asia provided valuable resources, they had cheap labor, and European countries could come in with superior technology and weaponry and sometimes kind of force them to do as they wanted. And this caused a lot of hatred towards foreigners, towards European countries. And so you see things like the Boxer Rebellion, where Chinese people rebel against the European forces. But largely, we see that the Europeans are able to contain control for a very long period of time. And so when you look at this map, you have some areas that are colonies, like here. India and Burma, they're British colonies. The British government is in control there. They tell them what to do. Same with Korea for Japan. And then you have spheres of influence. And these are areas where Britain has control here, Japan here, France has some control here, and they don't own China, but these are areas that they control parts of China. And so people in these areas really don't have much of a choice. They kind of have to work with these European governments, which isn't always something they like. 1914, World War I begins. We start to see fighting in Europe between different countries, and this fighting kind of goes into Asia as well. Because European countries have territory and colonies there, there's also some fighting there as well. After the war, a lot of Asian countries want some independence. They don't get it, which is frustrating. Japan fought on the side of the Allies. Britain, France, the United States helped win the war. But after the war, they're largely ignored. And they're frustrated by that. And they feel they should have a bigger seat at the table, and that's not given to them. So you can see this split up in 1914 at the beginning of World War I. Germany had some territories outside this map over here, which is why you did see some fighting going on here. So we move into the 1930s. Now in the 1930s, military leaders take most of the control in Japan, and they start to militarize and make a bigger military and expand and take new territory. And the thought process was, if you can become big enough and have enough resources and control the area around you, then you can prevent the Europeans from trying to take over. Japan, unlike most of Asia, had done fairly well at keeping foreign powers out, and they wanted that to continue. And so they continue to expand, which is part of the reason we have World War II. The United States brought into World War II by Japan attacking Pearl Harbor because they didn't want America to come into their territory. And so many Asian territories become battlegrounds between Japan and the Allies. And after the war, some of these countries are again denied independence. Vietnam is a great example of that. And so we see on this map, this is kind of the sphere of influence, the area that Japan took over and had control of. And you can see it gets pretty close to Pearl Harbor, a U.S. territory in Hawaii. And so the U.S. had control in some of these areas before, Guam and Philippine Islands. And so Japan took those areas from the United States as they attacked Pearl Harbor. And what resulted in this was a massive Pacific War and a lot of leapfrogging between different islands and nations and places between the Japanese and British and Australian and American troops, and nasty, nasty fighting, some of the worst fighting of the war. And the Japanese largely did not surrender. And therefore, if you were going to take over an island that had Japanese people on it, for the most part, you did that by killing everybody on that island. Because surrender was not something that they saw. And so the fighting in World War II, the war occurs between 1939 and 1945. In Japan, was attacking Manchuria and China, different areas like that, 1937 and before. And so, the war ends in 45 through the use of the atomic bombs and firebombing and literally the America destroying all the towns in Japan, realistically. And so the war is over there. The war ended a little bit earlier in Europe. And then we get to the next stage. So after World War II, countries in the world feel like they have to choose to either be communist or democratic. And some countries become democratic. Japan did. They didn't really have much of a choice because the United States had control of it after the war. So they made it a democratic nation, which ultimately has worked out pretty well for them. Other countries were split. Korea was split in half. The North is communist. The South is not. This is going to lead to war there. Vietnam wants independence. They don't get it, which is going to cause some problems too. So let's look at some of these specific areas. So you see that after the war, it's kind of a fight between communism and capitalism. The areas in blue have capitalism and democracy, just like the United States. The areas in red have communism. And so the government has complete control, and the government is in control of your economy as well. And we see that that kind of expands over into Asia. North Korea was communist, Vietnam becomes communist, and this concerns the United States because they don't feel communist is safe or good, and therefore they want to stop it from spreading. Whereas on the other hand, the Soviet Union wants to continue to expand and try to stop democracy from spreading. And so from 1945 to 1990, our world is in this deadlock between the Soviet Union and the United States. And there's a lot of wars that happen because of that, some of them in Asia. So Korea is split. The North is communist, the South is not. And the North invades the South, as you can see here, and the United States, along with the newly formed United Nations, get involved. And they push back, and they're very successful, except they pushed past this 38th parallel here. And they didn't know if China would come in to help North Korea because we didn't talk to China. So we talked through India, and those talks made us think that they won. Well, guess what? Once we cross the 38th parallel, China sends in 500,000 soldiers, and we get pushed back. And by the end of the war, it's a stalemate. We're basically back to where we are. What does that do long term? Long term, that leads to North Korea continuing to be communist and the leaders of that country having a lot of mistrust with the United States. And so even today with Kim Jong-un and the leadership there, they do not trust the United States. They do not trust South Korea. And it's a very problematic area because of this mistrust that ultimately started with the Korean War and this fight over communism and democracy. The other area is Vietnam. Now, during World War II, the Japanese were pushed out of Vietnam, and a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh and others fight for independence. Well, after the war, they believed that they should have control of the territory because they had pushed the Japanese out, and the Japanese had pushed the French out. Well, turns out the French regained control, and Ho Chi Minh and other Vietnamese people don't like this. So they fight to remove the French, which they're able to do. The US does not agree with this move because Ho Chi Minh is communist. And so the US comes in to fight with others in the south of Vietnam. And we have a brutal, brutal war that is very difficult to understand. And you have the North against the South, but you have the South against the South, and the government in the South isn't very strong. And the US is in this war that just looks impossible to win. And so after we leave the war, the whole country becomes communist. And so we see communism spread to Vietnam. So you can see the North Vietnamese versus South Vietnamese here. One note, Laos right here, this country, people in the country that helped the United States were allowed to come to the United States and settle in areas like Wausau, Wisconsin, and St. Paul, Minnesota. And they're known as the Hmong people. And so the Hmong people that came to America are originally from Laos. And they're allowed to come here afterwards because they were worried that North Vietnam, that won the war ultimately, may harm them for helping the United States. So kind of a side note there. In 1991, communism falls. And the countries that were part of the Soviet Union that were controlled by Russia now have independence. And so we see in 1991, a lot of countries gain their own freedom. And now their own governments. And so these countries are pretty young still, and some of them are still figuring things out. From there, we look at different types of governments. This is part of the notes you can fill in. So we're looking at an almanac here, and it tells you the different types as we go along. So we looked at those numbers, and we have 11 presidential parliamentary democracies, which are somewhat similar to what we have in the United States. We have 3 parliaments in general. 4 other democracies. We have 2 dictators, 1 king, 1 country the military is in control. In 8 countries, you have a dominant party, so that 1 party has control. And in 4 countries, you have a one-party communist system. Throughout the world, we have 4 communist countries, and they are China, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam. Let me check one other thing quick before I say anything more. Yeah. So you can fill your notes in with that. Stop the video if you need to. Now, in the future, our next unit is going to look at outsourcing. And Asia has taken a big role in the world because of its role with outsourcing. And so outsourcing is when you have your products made in a different country. Most companies do that. Nike, Reebok, Adidas. They're American companies, but they have the products made in another country. And that's usually because it's less expensive there. They do it to keep their costs low. So Nike might have their shoes made in China or Indonesia or India because it's less expensive than having workers make them here. And so we're going to look at this and talk about this. And so there's a lot of trade between the United States and Europe with Asia today. And some countries decide to do that with outsourcing. Others decide to have products made in their own country. But as you can see, there's a lot of trade throughout the world. We have 632, and this, according to this graph, billion, I'm guessing this is, let me check. Figures are billion, yeah, $632 billion worth of trade with Canada, $649 billion worth with the European Union. But if you look to Asia, 562 million to China, 100 billion to South Korea, 200 billion to Japan, 63 billion. This is where a lot of our products are made. And so there's a lot going on with Asia in terms of our products being made in those countries. And so your next assignment with Asia 2 is going to be looking at these different areas, looking at outsourcing and deciding, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And that can be your decision to make. So that's all I have for now. Hope you're doing well, and we'll go from there. Thanks.